Looking for NFL football? Stop right here. You found your home for weekly NFL talk and fantasy football. Coming to you live from the BackupPunter.com. This is the Backup Punter Podcast. Now, here's your host, the man who thinks fullbacks win championships, Keegan Matheson.
Welcome back. My name's Keegan Matheson here with you for episode 21 of the Backup Punter Podcast. If you're not subscribed already, check us out on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, subscribe wherever you listen. And for those of you who have been here each week, thank you. And what are you doing? But it's good to have you back. So this week, we're going to keep going with our fantasy football rankings. It is wide receiver time. If you want to hear about quarterbacks and running backs, check the last two podcasts, episode 20 and 19, where I get into that. This week, it's all about wide receivers. This is a big group, a talented group, and a group that has some really confusing tiers to it. You get to certain points in these rankings where there's 8 or 10 receivers that could go 20 different ways. So we're going to have to make some sense of that, find the best value in your draft, and we're going to get through all that today. Next week, if it's not too late, we'll do some tight end rankings. I'll have those up on the BackupPunter.com before we do that on a podcast, but that's an interesting group to get into as well. Travis Kelce, is he going to be able to overtake Jimmy Graham? Even Rob Gronkowski, is that too extreme? Tight end is another group where once you get outside of those top 5, I think you're better off just waiting, getting value in the 8, 9, 10, 11, those rounds, instead of jumping up and trying to grab a 4th or 5th guy. Now this week, we're also going to start off with some Johnny Manziel talk. I'm recording this podcast on Friday, and we are doing this just a bit early for a later release because I'm going shark fishing this weekend, which is apparently a thing that people do, and it's intriguing because when you go fishing, there's really not a chance that you can lose. You know, you go out, cast your line, and you win every time. Human wins, man wins once again. Shark fishing, I feel there's a chance I can lose. So this intrigues me, and we'll see how that goes. Now, as always, this fine podcast is brought to you by the even finer folks at Dynasty Sports Empire Fantasy Sports and Dynasty Sports Empire Podcast Network. So check them out on Twitter today, DSE_football. That's DSE_football. Send them a tweet, send them a direct message, ask how you can get involved in a Dynasty Fantasy Startup Football League today. Most fun you can have playing fantasy. Check them out. Tell them that I sent you. They are good people there. That's DSE_football. So like I said, let's touch on Johnny Manziel right now. And I was not planning on doing this, but since this is Friday, last night was Thursday, I watched Johnny Manziel versus Tyrod Taylor, Cleveland versus Buffalo. I was all over that game. I won't say two of my favorite players. Tyrod Taylor is one of my favorite players. Then Johnny Manziel is just an interesting player. And I have become so tired of this Johnny Manziel narrative. Ever since TMZ crept their way into the NFL coverage cycle, which, you know, it's the 24-hour, 7 days a week news cycle. It just gets worse and just gets worse. But ever since TMZ crept in, we're so much more concerned with these Manziel-type stories. His partying, his rehab. And if I read one more, clickbait article about the top 10 reasons Johnny Manziel should be, I'm going to claw my eyes out. But last night, he did very well. Manziel completed 10 of 18 passes for 118 yards. Yardage is never important to me, except for right here, because all too often you see Manziel complete, he was 5 of 6 last night. Well, he passed for 6 yards. Just these little dump-offs. He was pushing it downfield a little bit more. Sacked once. Out of 18 attempts, that's okay. Passing touchdown. He also ran, let me see, I have the numbers right in front of me. Ran 3 times for 19 yards. So that's okay. That's within control. What I liked about Johnny Manziel last night was that he looked like a quarterback. Period. He did not look like this crappy TMZ story. He didn't look like someone that was looking for the first lane to scramble through. He looked relaxed. He looks like the game has slowed down a little bit for him. And that's important because Josh McCown, he was 7 of 10 for 57 yards, but he threw 2 picks, took 3 sacks, and they were, those sacks were kind of a victim of the Buffalo defensive line, which is going to be one of, if not the best in football this year. But McCown just didn't look exciting. And he isn't. This is a guy who enjoyed a few games with the Chicago Bears in his mid-30s, and now has gotten a couple of contracts that he isn't really worth. I like the guy just fine as a veteran, backup type, maybe a starter to get you through some games if you need. But with Manziel here, this highlights something that I see going wrong with quarterbacks in the NFL. And it's, unfortunately, I don't know if it's something that you can just fix. It's the nature of the beast. With Johnny Manziel, even right now, even after that preseason game, McCown is still the starter. Maybe that changes over the next couple of weeks. Maybe he closes the gap enough to take over in week 4. We'll see. But with situations like Manziel, there is such a short leash for young quarterbacks in this league that teams get themselves into this point where they sort of half give up on the quarterback and never truly find out what they have. Just looking across the field at Buffalo, you kind of see that with E.J. Manuel. Now, I think he's a bad quarterback. I don't think he's a starter in this league. I like the guy. I just don't think he's a starting NFL quarterback, which, outside of 32 men, none of us are. That's fine. But he got his, almost one season, and then that's it. Done. For the rest of his career, he's going to be considered a guy that you maybe bring in to compete for a job. Maybe that works out. I don't know. With Johnny Manziel, if this was a team that was going to really make a playoff run this year, then okay. Get McCown in there, let the rest of the team win around him. I don't know if the Browns are quite there yet. Maybe they'll flirt with something, that's fine. But if they do this back and forth again, maybe it's Manziel, maybe it's McCown, they go through the whole year and they jerk Manziel around. Now, he's jerked himself around more than anyone ever could, don't get me wrong. But what my fear is that the Browns are going to get to the end of this season and still not know what the hell they have in Johnny Manziel. Then they enter the draft with Josh McCown, who's a year older, still under contract, but they don't have their quarterback. Since 1999, one quarterback, quarterback, has started all 16 games for the Browns. I think that was Tim Couch. Tim Couch it was. So that's, 16 years? Once a quarterback has started all 16 games. That's what they get into, whether it's Brady Quinn, Brandon Weeden. They half commit to everything. A lot of that has to do with brutal ownership. That's another story for another day. I've written about that before at thebackuppunter.com. But if they're not going to make the serious run this year, why not start Johnny Manziel? Give him the reins and let him fail. And if he does fail, fine. If you give him 6, 8, 9, 10 games, and he shows consistently, week to week, he tries to make progressions, he tries to grow, adjust his game, and it's not enough, and the adjustments he makes, opposing defenses are adjusting quicker, then you know. Then you go into next offseason and you say, you know what? Manziel's not the guy. Maybe we can pawn him off on somebody. Maybe Jerry Jones gets excited and trades for him, but Stephen Jones hopefully would stop him again. But in that case, the Browns enter the offseason, they know what they've got, and they can enter the draft, and if they get a top-level quarterback or the opportunity to draft one, then they can say, okay, this is our guy, and we're going to do it right this time. We're not going to be stupid. We're going to draft him and either start him right away or say there's 1 year of learning, then he's the starter full-time. Because they have not been decisive with Manziel. I know he hasn't made it easy on anybody, on himself, on the organization, on his coaches. But they're just kicking the can further up the road this year if they bounce back and forth. Because as we see, since 1999, how the Browns have gone, it is not just likely, it's almost a guarantee Manziel will start something this year. But we saw that last year. He came in for one game, got his face punched in. It was terrible. And then that's the image we have of him. That's the image the organization has of him. Give him at least a full season. I'm begging you. Because I do love the Browns. The league is such a better place when the Browns are good. The Browns, the Raiders, the Bills, these type of teams that have been trying to get that franchise guy, the NFL needs them to be good. And I hope that Johnny Manziel at least gets a look. I'm not one of these people who's just trying to shock jock radio and say, Manziel is the guy, Johnny Football is the guy. He can no. It's entirely likely he goes in there and stinks the joint up. But whether you fail or succeed, know what you have. If you're going to put that much draft stock into an asset, let yourself know what you've drafted. And they don't yet. So on to the wide receiver rankings this week. Now, I'm glad I waited until this week. I just had to redo my list here with number 13, Kelvin Benjamin, tearing an ACL, and that's too bad. I hope he comes back quick. I've wanted to do some reading. I don't know if it's, I'd assume it would be a little more difficult for a big, long, tall guy like Kelvin Benjamin to come back, opposed to a more of a jitterbug guy. I'm not sure. I hope he comes back fully healthy for 2016, because without Kelvin Benjamin, you're looking at Devin Funchess, who I don't trust to be rookie Kelvin Benjamin whatsoever. I don't know why Reggie Wayne isn't in Carolina already. There's got to be some guys available right now that are better than Philly Brown, the guys that are currently on this roster. They have to be. Jericho Cotchery. Are you kidding me? And I feel bad for Cam Newton, too, because he'd finally gotten his... I won't call him a franchise receiver yet, or not even a number one, because I think Benjamin does have a bit of a ceiling that I'm not terribly comfortable with. I don't think he's ever going to be that 1,500-yard guy. But it's too bad. And again, I said this with Arian Foster, this is why you do not draft in early August. I'll use myself as an example here. I dodged the hell out of a bullet. I am in a league with 6 keepers. It's an 8-team league, but we have massive rosters to make up for it. It's a fun league. I had Kelvin Benjamin as a keeper, one of my 6 keepers. He would have been my 5th or 6th. I wasn't wild about him, but I said, hey, this is decent value. If we had have drafted last week, like a lot of people do, I'm screwed right now. I've wasted a keeper, and I've got to turn to the draft and change my entire strategy. So that's why you wait until the end of training camp, the end of preseason to draft, because there's no advantage to doing it any differently. Now, that's not to say that I'm being a heartless fantasy owner. The thing I saw on Twitter this week that just made me want to climb through my screen and punch someone. And there were thousands of people tweeting Kelvin Benjamin. Oh, man, you just screwed over my fantasy team. Oh, I keepered you, man. Shut up. Fantasy football, as much as I love it, it's one of the worst things to happen to NFL fandom. Because admit it, if you're a Dallas Cowboys fan, and your team's playing the Packers, and you have Randall Cobb, and your team's up by 20 on the Packers, you're saying, okay, I hope the Packers come back here, feed Randall Cobb. I hope they don't win, but I hope they come back. You know what I mean? You get caught in those situations where you're cheering against yourself. And it turns football into this game where you're cheering for situations, not cheering for the game. But that's another 20 podcasts for another 20 days. We'll get away from that. Wide receiver rankings. Let's dive in. You don't need any more introduction. Number 1. Antonio Brown of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's going to start hot with Le'Veon Bell out, and after he is the number 1 option on that entire offense for weeks 1 and 2, he's going to stay hot. He is the best receiver in the NFL, and he does it all without being 6'3", 220 pounds, which is impressive. It really is. I think he's going to have all the counting stats in the world if he's healthy. And I don't see a scenario where he becomes anything less than a top 3. If you pick him the first receiver, perfect. Number 2 receiver. I struggled with this one, but I'm going to put Dez Bryant as my number 2 receiver. Most people have Demaryius Thomas. I like Dez Bryant. He is the number 1 and number 2 option in the Dallas passing game. Without DeMarco Murray, and with a defense that I think still has some holes, they're going to be throwing the football a lot. I think Jason Witten might get some red zone work this year, but Dez Bryant is still the guy. He is Tony Romo's number one. His boo. The balls are going his way. And I like them to go his way all season long, which is why I have Demaryius Thomas down at number 3. I'm still worried, and you're tired of me talking about this. I know. I'm sorry. I'll send you flowers. I'm afraid that Peyton Manning is going to have one of those 5 or 6 point weeks in week 12, 13, 14 when you need him. I think he's going to get someone to the playoffs and then ruin their playoffs. I just think that's how it's going to go. A, because he'll slow down through the year. B, when you get that old, it's a little easier to get injured. He's not 22 right now. And C, they're going to be a run-heavy attack, much more so than any other time in Peyton Manning's career. So just by chance, there could be any week where they decide to run the football pretty heavily. Do you think when the Broncos get up in a football game, they're going to keep throwing? No. When they get up by 15, they're going to say, okay, let's protect Peyton. We need this arm later in the year. Demaryius Thomas, he's got every chance to be a number 1 receiver in fantasy. Any of these top 5 guys, they can come out and be the number 1 guy. Difference between 2 and 3 is nothing. But for those reasons, I'm going to slide Demaryius Thomas below Dez Bryant. Number 4, I have Julio Jones, who I think, strangely, is one of the more underrated fantasy receivers. Not underrated in terms of rankings, but people don't talk about him as the number 1 guy. It's Dez, Demaryius, and Antonio Brown. Julio Jones, he's just as talented as the rest of them. He has every opportunity to be the number 1 scoring receiver in fantasy football this year. If he stays healthy, he's the clear-cut number 1 in his offense. Roddy White is good, just good enough to take some coverage away, which is very helpful, especially when you've got one high safety, if that can shift to Roddy White's side every once in a while. And he's got a franchise quarterback. He has Matt Ryan. If Julio Jones is open, he'll get the football, and he can make some big plays. He can produce those 60-yard touchdowns, boom, 12 points. You just won your week. I've got him as number 4. No problem moving him up, though. Number 5, my boy, Odell Beckham Jr. I think that he is easily the number 1 in New York. We all know this. All these guys are number 1s. Eli Manning loves him. I'm worried about this recurring. It always seems like there's a soft tissue injury with Odell Beckham. Hamstring, he did miss the first few games last year. I don't know if he needs some help, stretching. I'll send him some exercises. I've got him at number 5. This is the first point in the rankings where I can see a guy finishing much lower. He's going to be facing the number 1 cornerback with safety help every single time. Now, he can make the circus catches. Fantastic. Good for him. And he's also a great route runner. But is he going to take a step back now that everyone knows who he is? I don't really think so. But it's just one of these things you need to consider. We try to make such absolute statements about everyone. Oh, this guy's going to get better. No, this guy's going to regress. It doesn't always have to be so written in concrete like that. With Odell Beckham, just keep it in mind. Last year, for those first few games when he came back, nobody knew who the hell this guy was. Nobody was talking about him. By the end of the season, when people figured him out, well, he was making some catches that no human being on earth makes. Is all of that going to go right this year? I don't know. We'll find out. Number 6, Jordy Nelson of the Packers, another underrated guy. He will get a high volume from Aaron Rodgers, and he gets the deep ball as well. Touchdowns, he should have at least 8, very minimum 8, but I'm comfortable predicting he'll get 10 or 11 as well. Number 7, AJ Green, a guy that disappointed me last year. I can't keeper him in the league because I took him with a first-round pick, and it's a same round keeper in that league. But I see a big year from AJ Green. Contract year, money talks. But I also think this whole offense is going to be much better. If you get Eifert going, Jeremy Hill. God damn, I love Jeremy Hill. I wish I could draft him in every league. I know I probably won't get him in one. But AJ Green, I see a big year from him. And you know what? Andy Dalton, make your jokes. He'll do enough. Okay? He'll do enough. Let me throw a quick thought at you here. This is, much of this show is unplanned. If Andy Dalton was not a shy and unassuming red-haired quarterback, would people take him a little more seriously? He just seems like the bashful kid from up the street. But if he looked more like a Tom Brady scowling on the field, I don't think people would make such a joke of him. He's had some seasons where his stats are surprisingly good in terms of fantasy. So, is he who I want to build my franchise around? No, but he, just like Jay Cutler, if you have one of Jay Cutler's receivers, Jay Cutler's not elite, but he gets people the football a hell of a lot. So don't worry about that. Number 8. This one hurts to do, but Calvin Johnson down at 8. Now, I guess I've grown up in an era where there were a few years where it was Calvin Johnson and everyone else. Then the discussion was, who can be the next Calvin Johnson? Well, as we see here, there's 7 guys at least that are the next Calvin Johnson. This is the wide receiver age. People call it the age of the passing game, but it's not just the quarterbacks. It's these wide receivers, freaks of nature. So, Calvin Johnson at 8, how healthy is he going to be? If you've got him on your roster, I don't think he has nearly as much keeper value as anyone in this top 10 either, because what if he only has a couple years left? That's a big, big body. More can go wrong with a big body than a small body. Now, I trust him to stay healthy and still produce extremely well, but again, just like Odell Beckham, it's not enough to write this guy off, but it's enough to say, I've got to consider that. Now, with Matt Stafford, I fully trust him. He just like Cutler. I don't want to build my franchise around Stafford, but he gets the football to receivers, and he can push the football down the field. From the receiver standpoint, more than a good enough quarterback. And of course, Calvin Johnson is going to be all over the red zone, everything like that. So if you can grab him as the 8th guy off the board, I think you're still happy. You'll look at your roster the next day and you'll see Calvin Johnson Jr. in your wide receiver and you'll say, okay. Number 9, Alshon Jeffrey. Just like Brandon Marshall last year for the Bears, I think he gets fed targets, absolutely fed. Especially if Kevin White, it's going from, maybe the start of the season, maybe he's going to miss 6 weeks. Well, it could keep him out for the year. Until we hear otherwise, let's just assume that Kevin White is done for the year, which is too bad, but it's like when Kelvin Benjamin was injured the other day. People said, well, he's down, we don't know what it is yet. Whenever I see something like that, I say, let's just assume the worst until we find out something better. That's the safest way to take it in fantasy. Don't assume the best in fantasy football. That's how you get a 0 for your week. Alshon Jeffrey, no problem. The volume is going to be there, even if he's not as talented as a guy behind him here. He's going to get so much more volume. Number 9, no problem taking Jeffrey. Number 10, Randall Cobb. They're in Green Bay. Unique in Green Bay because they have Nelson and Cobb. Then, of course, they've got guys like Devontae Adams coming up and Eddie Lacy. There's a lot of footballs to go around. So Randall Cobb won't have 110 receptions. He won't have 1,600 yards. He might struggle to reach his touchdown totals from last year. I mean, look at the guy. He's not a red zone target. A lot of those were just from, great routes, zipping in and out, some deep throws. But still, this guy's a top 10 receiver. I've got no problem with him at number 10. And incredible keeper value. Absolutely incredible. Speaking of incredible keeper value, Mike Evans, number 11 with Jameis Winston down in Tampa Bay there. Vincent Jackson is, should I say slowing down? I don't want to because I love Vincent Jackson. Listeners of this podcast know how I get stuck with my old veteran fantasy guys. Guys like Frank Gore at running back. Vincent Jackson is that guy for me. I've keepered him for years and years and years in one of my leagues. This year, first time that I'm not doing it. Regardless, Mike Evans, as the number 11 receiver here, he has the potential to lead the NFL in receiving touchdowns. You can't usually say that about guys around here. For example, my number 12 guy, T.Y. Hilton, he doesn't have that potential, I don't think. But Evans at 11 certainly does. Keeper value through the roof. So speaking of Hilton, a newly rich man, he got paid. But, like I said last week, even if it's a bit of an overpay, whatever. You get your star. You get Andrew Luck's guy. T.Y. Hilton, keeper value is nuts again playing with Andrew Luck. He's still young. Now, I love Hilton because he gets it done, kind of like Antonio Brown a bit. He gets it done without being this hulking physical mass of a receiver. And that's awesome. Good for Hilton. Now, I do think that he has a bit of a cap on his potential, just given the weapons around him. Andre Johnson, Moncrief, They've got Frank Gore now in the backfield. They've got a rookie that's looking really good sometimes, Philip Dorsett. He'll at least be involved, so this is going to be more of a widespread attack, but Hilton is the guy. No problem with him at 12. Now, skipping Kelvin Benjamin. A moment of silence for KB, originally number 13. On to the new number 13. DeAndre Hopkins of Houston. Now, if you're watching Hard Knocks Houston Texans, DeAndre Hopkins is probably your new favorite guy. He's hilarious. He loves to go shopping. He's a big fan of Starbucks lattes. He would get along great with your girlfriend, I think. Mr. Steal Your Girl. DeAndre Hopkins is far and away number 1 in Houston. Who's his quarterback going to be? I don't really know. At this point, I don't care because it's going to be, the 28th best quarterback in the league, something like that. You know what I mean? But DeAndre Hopkins is so gifted. If you're bored, Google DeAndre Hopkins' hands. I don't think anyone in this league has hands that are as big as DeAndre Hopkins. He's going to haul in everything. His catch, his conversion percentage on his targets, I don't think he's going to catch a high percentage of them, just because he's going to be so tightly covered. But he's going to get so many damn targets that he's going to get counting stats. And the Houston Texans are probably going to play from behind every now and then. So I'm going to jump on Hopkins. I won't really reach for the guy. He's got to come to me because he's got a ceiling. But I still like him. Number 14, Emmanuel Sanders, a guy that I'm not wild about. I don't even know if I like having him ranked this high from Denver, but he's one of those guys that once you get out of the elite options, if you missed out, jump on Emmanuel Sanders. A big year last year. Can he repeat this year? Especially with Cody Latimer there, but again, there's some touchdowns to go around now that Demaryius Thomas is gone. So we'll see. Number 15, a guy that I really like, Jordan Matthews in Philadelphia. I think that Jordan Matthews is going to have a very big year. People are so obsessed with this, Odell Beckham, Mike Evans, these rookie receivers, Sammy Watkins. Just because Jordan Matthews was a little bit worse than them last year, if you look at the big picture, he still had an incredible rookie year. But people just need this year one, boom, superstar, end of story. Well, Jordan Matthews is going to be that guy that breaks out in year 2, and I think he's going to do it in a big way. He fits that offense perfectly. I think he's going to get a lot of deep targets, red zone targets, whatever target you want. High ceiling at 15, so I don't mind if you jump up a bit for him. 16, Brandon Cooks in New Orleans. I think Drew Brees is going to pepper this guy. Absolutely pepper him with targets. Trouble for Brandon Cooks will be getting into the end zone. Much like our next guy at 17, Sammy Watkins. Now, for different reasons, put Sammy Watkins with Drew Brees. Ooh. Sammy Watkins, I think he's going to end up with Tyrod Taylor at quarterback, which I love. Tyrod Taylor, 8 days a week for me. But he's not a guy that's really going to benefit his receivers with huge counting stats. Tyrod Taylor's more of a guy that'll rush for 40 yards, pass for 198, and just really control the game. You know what I mean? So, Sammy Watkins, I did keep him in another league because it was the same round keeper, so I think I got to hold on to him in the 10th round. I drafted him as a rookie, so I'm happy with that, but I'm not expecting big things. He does have that keeper value, and I'll continue to hold on to him just because imagine Buffalo. Not if they got a Peyton Manning, not if they got Aaron Rodgers, but if they got a middle-of-the-road guy, if they got a Phillip Rivers, if they got a Tony Romo, just a quarterback, Sammy Watkins would be amazing. Number 18, Julian Edelman. I don't think he misses a beat with Jimmy Garoppolo. Once Tom Brady comes back, he'll be the number 1 target in the offense. Julian Edelman's one of those fine options, and he's going to be steady. That's what you'll like about Edelman. He'll be steady. Once you get to this point, you have to start making a decision. Well, do I want these splash weeks or a steady guy? If you've got a good receiver or two ahead of him, Edelman makes a great choice. Number 19, Keenan Allen, a guy that I've been, should I say stuck with? Have I been stuck with him on a couple fantasy teams? Well, he's got this tantalizing potential. Hasn't quite lived up to it yet. Didn't last year. This looks like his season at 19, Keenan Allen. 20, Vincent Jackson, there's my boy. Like I said, I think he's slowing down a little bit, but with Jameis Winston, he's going to get a ton of targets, and a lot of targets in the red zone. He's going to put up one of these, maybe 1,000 yards, 1,100 with 7-8 touchdowns. It's not going to be this over-the-top season, but it's going to be perfectly fine if you're looking for a mid-range guy. Number 21, Amari Cooper. I have seen some videos of Amari Cooper out of Raiders training camp that have made me say, whoa. The routes he's running are incredible. I don't doubt a single thing about Amari Cooper. But again, this is the wide receiver position. The most important thing to consider when ranking a wide receiver is their quarterback. Do I love Carr? I don't know if I do, and I get heat for this all the time, but look at the statistics. Last year, his yards per attempt was atrocious. Yes, he did some things. He had a couple of games, but just because he's the first decent Raiders quarterback in a long time doesn't mean he's good yet. I have all the confidence in the world that he can get there, but he's got to show me a little bit more, because last year I think got a bit too hyped. Number 22, I've got Brandon Marshall of the Jets, and I guess it's Ryan Fitzpatrick throwing him the ball. Brandon Marshall, he used to be a top 5 guy not long ago, but again, he's not too old. He's still going to absolutely rake in targets. No problem with him in around that value. 23, Jeremy Maclin. So at 23, getting Maclin, how much are the Chiefs going to push it down the field? That's the big beaten-to-death storyline. Oh, the Kansas City Chiefs were going to push the football down the field. Extend the passing game. Use Travis Kelce more. Well, will they? I don't know. It's all just coach speak in the offseason. But still, Jeremy Maclin he's probably a top, definitely top 20, maybe a top 15 receiver in terms of fantasy value. I've got him at 23. 24, Golden Tate. I don't know if he can repeat last year, especially if Eric Ebron gets going in Detroit. But look out again if Calvin Johnson goes down. 25, I've got Andre Johnson in Indianapolis. This is a guy that people wrote off a bit too quickly after he departed from Houston. No problem with him here. Number 26, a guy on the opposite end of the spectrum from Andre Johnson. I've got Allen Robinson of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, I'm nervous as hell to put a Jaguar on this list because I don't know what Blake Bortles is yet. I don't know what he is going to be this year or even next year. But Allen Robinson has the potential to be a top 15 fantasy receiver. Now, I don't know how likely is that? Not very. But if you're picking down at this point, look at a guy like Andre Johnson. He's not going to jump up and be in the top 15. Is Golden Tate going to be? No. Jeremy Maclin? No. Allen Robinson at least has that shred of potential. And all the reports I'm reading out of Jags camp is that he's looking very good. Number 27, Nelson Aguilar of the Eagles. He put some moves on tape in week 1 of the preseason that were just filthy. Burned down the sideline. His speed, I think, hasn't gotten enough love. Everyone said he was the perfect fit. The perfect fit for Chip Kelly's scheme, and I'm starting to believe it. Number 28, Eric Decker, now a member of the New York Jets. I think Ryan Fitzpatrick will be a good thing for Eric Decker. He'll still get his touchdowns. Again, he'll be 900, 1,000 yards, 7-8 touchdowns and around there, but good value. Number 29, I've got Jarvis Landry, my boy. I don't like him as much in fantasy as I do in, the ever-important real football. Not nearly as much. But reports I'm reading out of Miami are that Jarvis Landry is far and away the favorite receiver of Ryan Tannehill. Now, if that's the case, there's some value there. I've read a lot of beat reporters writing that he's even getting consistent looks in the red zone, which isn't where he profiles. But if it's happening, can he be the 29th best fantasy receiver? Absolutely. And since I've had to add someone now to my top 30, with Kelvin Benjamin gone, I'm not going to add anyone. Most people have this guy ranked outside their top 40, which I think is criminal. Marques Colston of the New Orleans Saints at number 30. Even at 30, I'm a bit iffy on that. This guy, before the Jimmy Graham show arrived, he was the red zone target. Marques Colston is getting a little older, as we all are, but he is going to be a downfield target, short target, red zone target, and one of Drew Brees' favorite targets. Who else do they have in the red zone right now? Brandon Cooks? Well, he can run those little inside routes and maybe shake a guy off. But there's no Jimmy Graham there right now. There's no corner fade to the end zone there right now. The Saints are going to be better at home. They're going to be in a lot of tight games, which is good for receivers because that means they're still passing the ball. I love Marques Colston there. There will be a few weeks where he only gets you those 4 or 5 points, but he is going to score touchdowns. So I like that. So that's the top 30 right there. That's too much to read. You have a rewind button if you're really that curious, but I doubt you are. I'll get those up on the backuppunter.com here sometime soon as well for your reading pleasure. Now let's look at some flyers you might take. Tier 1 of flyers, guys in the later rounds. I've gotten some questions about Arizona, Michael Floyd versus John Brown. Both of those guys, do get some love. And in my opinion, it's pretty tight. It really is. So it comes down to a question of who will you get at a better value. And I like John Brown. Everything I'm reading out of Cardinals camp is that he is almost overtaking both Floyd and Fitzgerald. Now, Fitzgerald could be terrible. He'd still be the number one receiver. That's a non-issue. Larry Fitzgerald's the number one. But John Brown, he's a favorite of Carson Palmer as well. Deep threat. I'm reading that he's getting a little better on the short stuff as well. I think he could really break out. The Cardinals had those 3 1,000-yard guys years back with Bolden and Breston Fitzgerald. I don't think that'll happen this year, but John Brown will be fantasy relevant. Another guy I like, tier 1 of flyers, Steve Smith Sr. Why the hell not? Brashad Perryman is banged up, and I don't think he's really much of a factor this year. Max Williams isn't going to factor in much at tight end because rookie tight ends don't do that. Now, guys like Marlon Brown, Campanaro, some of these guys are pushing for contributing roles at wide receiver, but Steve Smith, he's the number one there. Joe Flacco needs to throw the football to somebody. Steve Smith is 50 years old, but he was last year, too. He might taper off later in the year like he did, but, you're going to get production there. And I'm a fan of picking the odd veteran late, because once it gets into round 9, 10, so many people are seeking these high upside guys. But you can swoop in and grab a guy like a Steve Smith or like a Larry Fitzgerald who's going to free fall in drafts. Even though they're not that attractive of a name, not a name you want, they're much safer, and you're more likely to get something out of them. Now let's look down at tier 2. These are guys you'll look at really late. Marquise Lee of the Jags. This is another situation where I like a guy more on the field than I do on fantasy. I've always liked him since he came out of USC, but if he can earn the starting role across from Allen Robinson, maybe. Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks, he's not a secret to anybody anymore. Cecil Shorts will be starting in Houston. Big fan of Shorts. He was a poor man's Greg Jennings when he was healthy. I think he can be healthy again, and there's going to be targets. Marcus Wheaton. I think he's going to be a better value pick than Martavis Bryant. The Martavis Bryant hype train is a bit out of control, and I'm kind of getting off the tracks on that one now. But Marcus Wheaton, why not? Ben Roethlisberger said he is way improved this training camp. Ben Roethlisberger heaped praise onto this guy going into year 3, I think he is, so that's a jump-off point. And then I'll leave you with this one to, so you can take this, then never take me seriously again. If you're desperate, injured, bye weeks, why not chuck in Dwayne Bowe for a week? Now, I think he is going to be probably the worst starting receiver in the NFL. I'm done with Dwayne Bowe. But if you're up against a wall and you need to try and find a touchdown some week, he's going to be their number one option in the red zone. And at certain points in the season, you need to forget the player name you're looking at, and you need to look at the player situation. They've signed him there for a reason. If he's healthy, he's not going to be great, but he could give you a touchdown when you need it. And as always, 2 weeks into the season, there are going to be some receivers emerge that nobody has talked about. Nobody at all. And they'll probably be the guys that save your season. A guy like Odell Beckham last year. Were you one of the people that dropped him? Thankfully, I wasn't, but I know there's a lot of you out there. So those are the wide receiver rankings. Like I said, might come back next week and talk about tight ends, because even if you have drafted, unless you get a top 5 or 6 guy, you're going to be changing tight ends a lot. It'll be like an oil change throughout the year. And I'm even considering that strategy myself. Getting a rotation of 3 or 4 guys that I cycle on waivers by matchups, unless I get one of the top guys at value. We'll see. So as always, you can follow on Twitter at The Backup Punter, like the page on Facebook by the same name, or visit thebackupunter.com. Once the season gets going, I will have your weekly fantasy football sleepers, waiver ads, and then your studs and duds after every week when we look back at who had the game-winning and game-losing weeks for your fantasy teams. So my name is Keegan Matheson. Thank you for joining again. Episode number 21. I have been very, very happy with the support, the follows we're getting on iTunes, on Stitcher, and especially on YouTube. A lot of people with love for YouTube. So subscribe there as well if that's what you use to do your podcast music listening. So join me next week. We'll talk tight ends. Episode number 22. This has been the Wide Receiver Rankings, brought to you by Dwayne Bowe and the Backup Punter Podcast. And as always, hopefully, all of your punts in life stop on the 1-yard line. Let's talk next week.